So this is the last evening, isn't it? Goodness me. What do you think we should talk about?
We were talking about detachment and right action over dinner. Can we talk about that a little more? I was asking if detachment meant, well, if it was possible to act from detachment, or if the two were mutually exclusive.
Sorry?
If detachment meant there could be no action, or if you could act from a state of detachment, then largely.
Anything else?
The second question.
Mm-hmm.
There's something I didn't understand on the talk about Lilith. I think you said that Lilith came as a reincarnation through Mary Magdalene as a spiritual marriage to Jesus, the former first Adam.
I didn't quite say that.
Ah, well, you sort of said it, didn't you?
Mm.
And I wasn't sure what that was. That as sort of an atonement, as it were, but the problem has still come through, and Lilith is still emerging and influencing through this toxic level. I mean, what actually happened then when there was the incarnation through Mary Magdalene?
He wants a big grift, doesn't he?
Mm.
Anything else?
Well, actually, sorry, Tony. I've said enough.
No, carry on, Peter.
What happens when you were talking about the avatar, which is bursting through the trapped energies to allow the change in direction of the energy? Is this the way that nature is seeking to correct something, or should there be a mechanism which releases these energies anyway, and the avatar has to come down to correct a malfunction, as it were? I mean, why doesn't nature bring its own balance? What is going wrong to cause the blockage?
Is the coming of the avatar part of nature? Does it work almost like a law of physics?
But when something has already gone wrong and evil is in ascendance, but what causes the evil is ascending because of the blockage and the trapped energy.
But the trapped energy is the consequence of the human mental level, isn't it? So the celestial plumber has to come and unblock it.
The spiritual dynamo.
That's right. Anything else, friends? You were going to say something, Tony.
I don't know if it made me up. The evolutionary force and the involutionary force. It seems that, according to tradition at any rate, the Kali Yuga's got the ways to run yet, and it also seems, from a physics point of view, if there's some sort of link with an expanding universe before it moves back again, that there's a fair way to run into manifestation before the return or the evolutionary impulse, at least in a more general sense, takes place. How does that affect the crisis now, and what is the place of those people who are attempting, as it were, to return when, to a certain extent, there's a large movement on, at least on the physical level, and in terms of materialisation, almost pushing in the other direction.
Anything else?
Well, going to attachment, is it possible to have a relationship without a detachment? And does that involve real love? Is that, would that be love in the deeper sense?
Anything else? How long have we got? Yes, Pete. But you spoke. Another thing Pearlie and I were discussing a little earlier was if you can be armed and disarmed, if you can be affected and disaffected, etc., etc., can you be gruntled and disgruntled? But there should be. And I imagine at one time there must have been, maybe in the Saxon period, do you think? It sounds like a Saxon word, doesn't it? They'd say gruntled. Anyway, oh dear, where are we? Now, really, how concerned are we about attachment and detachment? Does it alarm us, the idea of being detached? Is there perhaps a difference inherent in the language between detached and non-attached? Is there? What's the Sanskrit? Sure, I forget. Isn't that silly? Never mind, we don't really need the Sanskrit. I was just curious to know. Because the Sanskrit word would be just attach with the negative in front, wouldn't it? So non-attached. Is that right? I think it is. And yet, with the vagaries of English, we can possibly differentiate between detached and non-attached. Vivekananda was demonstrably a passionate man. Could such a man be non-attached, detached? He was a man who, by all accounts, had experienced, amongst other things, the nirvikalpa samadhi, the samadhi of total extinction, and returned from that. Ramakrishna certainly experienced the nirvikalpa samadhi. These were men of passion, tremendous mental and emotional force went into everything they did, everything to which they were committed, shall we say. I can remember my own confusion when, as an 18-year-old, I formed a firm image of what the truly detached yogi was and should be. The image was based on Ramana, seemingly, by all accounts. Characterized by non-reaction to almost everything. But then he wasn't exactly peppered with a vast range of compelling, insistent, demanding crises. And on that theme I have often wondered, is it the real crisis that compromises our detachment? Or is it the peppering of the nervous system with an incessant and insistent avalanche of small things? Is it the last of the irksome trivia that makes you blow your top? Or is it the really big issue that has to be faced? Can we face death itself with a measure of detachment? But we can get a bit irked at what happens in the office. I think one thing we have to bear in mind is that yoga was born at a very ancient period when the state of the human psyche, the structure of the human psyche, was different from what we know now, and the world we inhabit was very different. The world of the ancient yogi had space. There were few people. There was not the human mass that we know now. Technology as we know it did not exist. There was space and there was time. And there was altogether an absence of the compression to which average humanity is today subject. I say compression. It's the best word I know. I mean, obviously, the lower orders, the slaves and so on, doubtless had their pressures and their problems. But the context was different. There was a difference in time and a difference in space, not only without, but inwardly. There was a much readier recognition of the existence of and the need for inner space. And out of that was born yoga. And very probably, yoga came to these ancient peoples. By yoga I mean the meditational dimension. Came to these ancient peoples a little easier than it comes to us now. Everything around us is agitato, isn't it? Everywhere. Never before have there been these massive conurbations with 8, 10 or more million on top of each other. Agitating each other, agitating the atmosphere, everything in agitation. What are we talking about when we talk about detachment and the mental condition? Is there even another factor? You know, Teilhard de Chardin coined a word, the noosphere, and stated at its simplest, generation after generation of the human race pours thought energy into the planet. And this clusters as a force around the planet. And as the planet grows older, and as the human race becomes more numerous, this noosphere becomes more dense, as an invisible belt around the earth. And the correspondence of this to Jung's collective unconscious, I imagine, is very close. In the operation of the noosphere, Teilhard de Chardin speaks of convergence, things happening at the same time, and events being drawn, as it were, to each other through what he saw as energy attracting like energy within the noosphere. Jung spoke of synchronicity and seemed to be essentially saying the same thing. What Teilhard stressed was that this noosphere is a growing and extending and intensifying factor in the life of the planet and the evolution of the planet. Now, one thing that we have to bear in mind, I think, is that when the concepts, the philosophies of yoga, Eastern metaphysics were evolved, there were major differences in the state of the planet. The noosphere was much less dense, much thinner than now. Today, it is a dense cloud around us. There's no eluding it. It has forces, negative, positive, pure and toxic. All raging and straining and buffeting. And the human entity, the human being, is part of the whole, part of the planet, part of the cosmos, part of the collective psyche, part of the whole motion of life itself. No man is an island. Into all this, technology is doing things, the effects of which may not be fully understood. We are pouring through technology an endless stream of signals into the atmosphere, into the noosphere. And through communication technology, the outpouring is at best largely rubbish. It's all vibrating, and it's not lost. It doesn't go away. It's part of the accumulation of this noosphere. The human race is making prodigious problems for itself. Now, what is a yogi? What is a yogi? We say a yogi is this, a yogi is that. Maybe there is a certain sort of human type that is innately disposed to be a yogi. Maybe. Like all human types, it's composed of the several principles that make up the totality of a human being. Just as there can be innately a musical human type, an artistic human type, a science-biased human type, mathematical type, so there can be a yoga type. Now all of this is determined by those elements which form, as it were, the skeletal structure of the noosphere. That is, the samskaras. The impressions left in the subconscious mind of all of past experience that has accumulated, has coagulated, has structured itself within the consciousness, the subconsciousness of the human entity over many, many, many incarnations. And those samskaras, those trapped energies, are still there, constantly being added to by the enlarging flow of human experience, which we encounter as we live day by day, hour by hour. We are increasing all the time, just as the noosphere itself is increasing and intensifying all the time. Now, so far as the human entity is concerned, the samskaras project a collective energy, a collective vibration, which forms the ego structure of the self. That energy from which the self is formed projects its own karma. Its own karma gives shape to experience and personality. And from that karma there emerges the inevitability of what is the dharma, the right course of action, the true way of that individual. Now, coming back to the yogi, if there is such a thing, a yogi has been a yogi probably for a long time. There is a certain inclination to the samskaras and a certain predisposition to the psyche that is a consequence of those samskaras, to the human structure that emerges as a result. So innately, a yogi is one who is hypersensitive. We've said that often, haven't we? You have to be hypersensitive. We all must become more and more sensitive. Without sensitivity, there can be no perception. Without perception, there can be no fullness of experience. Without that fullness of experience, there can be no insight. Without that insight, there can be no wisdom. And overall, there can be no growth. We need more and more sensitivity, hypersensitivity, supersensitivity, don't we? And the more sensitive we are, the more we shall perceive, the more we will know. Because as we become more, so we shall know more. And we only know more when we become more. Is that right? Now, here is a basic problem we have discussed over the years quite often. You need sensitivity. You must have hypersensitivity if you're truly inwardly developing and growing. But the more sensitive you are, the more your inner being will reverberate with the impact of experience, won't it? Won't it? It even raises these questions, you see, when we are talking about, yes, this is the ideal state of detachment or non-attachment, and this is what should happen. We have a pattern in mind, which is some sort of received impression from somewhere else. Could a Ramakrishna survive in the dense, lower life of the world that we know? Could a Ramakrishna only survive within the precincts of a temple and an atmosphere of extraordinary purity? Even Krishnamurti, he asked me a lot of questions once. Where do you live? London. If I had to live in London, I would die. I would just die. And he probably would have become ill. Are we talking about detachment or a lack of detachment? Or are we talking about something that must also be considered? The state of the organism, the organic being. In Krishnamurti, we had a being from another age, dropped into our time and our organic situation, that hadn't, as it were, evolved through the psychological and the genetic evolutionary processes that build up their own compensatory pattern of responses, and I'm sort of avoiding the term defense mechanisms, but you can sense what I'm saying, can't you? The beauty of Krishnamurti was his vulnerability. But his vulnerability in our kind of context, by our kind of context I mean the context that we can find ourselves experiencing, his vulnerability would have meant his early death. I'm sure of it. He'd have just quit the body. He was not equipped to function in this way at this time. Can you see what I'm getting at? It used to fascinate me in the days when I first encountered Krishnamurti, watching him interact after a talk, sometimes a marvellous talk, extraordinary atmosphere. Then he'd be standing around at friend's house, Euston Road. If you went down to the loo, and you'd find a corridor, and there was Krishnamurti meeting and greeting people. It was even comic to see his reactions to some people. Some people would approach him and hopping from foot to foot and dodging about and trying to get away. Not what the image would have us believe was the sublime state of yogic calm. You see what I mean? There has to be, as a sheath or series of sheaths to the human intelligence, a structure that nature has evolved to enable the intelligence to adapt to the environment. Now, a human being is an amazingly adaptable creature. Amazing what humanity can do. A human being can, at one extreme, play the piano like Schnabel. At another extreme, it can calculate like Einstein. At another extreme, it can exist at the bottom of the ocean. At another extreme, it can soar through the stratosphere or into outer space. At another extreme, it can swim the channel. At another extreme, it can live on the North Pole. At another extreme, it can live on the equator. It can live up the mountains. It can live in goodness knows what contexts. Amazingly adaptable, given a phase by which adaptation can take place. You see what I mean? Now, everything is happening in the modern world at this time, in this century, at an unbelievable rapid pace. Energies are outstripping development. There is an amazing lack of equilibrium and balance in all this, and it's a commonplace to say that our intellectual capability, especially in its technological applications, is vastly outstripping not only our spiritual development, but in terms of what's manifest, but our moral sense. Everything is out of phase. Everything is out of focus. What I'm saying is we're on dicey ground if we have a picture that's developed from a formula, a plausible formula, that has been fed to us through a tradition, and a tradition that is very, very ancient, and a tradition that arose when the structure of the human psyche was very different, when the world itself was very different from the one we know now. Now, obviously, there are generalities which must apply, do apply, still apply. But when you get a man who has experienced the nirvikalpa samadhi, being very prone to agitations, when he encounters our Western civilization, indeed as it was a century ago, we must be careful about how we apply these formulae. Krishnamurti survived within a sort of, just survived, a sort of protective cocoon with a queue of millionaires anxious to ensure that he wasn't subject to any struggle for survival. And this was right. They were doing the right thing. We needed our Krishnamurti. But Krishnamurti was not quite a complete man. In terms of nature had not built the fullness of an adapted being that could function fully in all ways and forms in our society. He was a wonderful phenomenon. But he was a voice, primarily a voice that was needed, very much needed, but under which, given the man himself in the fullness, you could not write QED. To a greater extent you could with Vivekananda. He could span all the continents, function and interact on every level with everyone. But not quite fully adapted. He couldn't live beyond 39 years. The impact of what we call society and the noosphere upon that immense, powerful but hypersensitive being meant that nature had not yet evolved a structure which could deal with all this. Now, ipso facto, it must mean that one who has experienced the nirvikalpa samadhi does know about non-attachment, because he knows about non-being. An experience in action involves the polarization of being and non-being, and a balance between them. Am I right? One who has experienced nirvikalpa samadhi, that is, absorption into non-being, has comprehended the polarity between being and non-being. Has he not? And has found a balance between the two. Yes? Or has found at least a comprehension of a kind that gives a rare, even unique perspective on life and death itself. And when we talk about being and non-being, we're also talking about action and non-action. Because the voidness is the non-being. And the action is the active entity being. Is that right? So here is the question. Is it possible to act with being and non-being in their fullness, in right equilibrium? Now, right equilibrium might well be a variable factor, depending upon the circumstance, the nature of the challenge, the dharma that has to be discharged. But there is this further thing. Has nature yet evolved the entity that can carry these negative and positive charges of force? Has it? The short answer is yes, it has, I believe. But only as a prototype appearing here and here and here in history. The supreme prototype that we know of being, maybe, Christ. There is also the Buddha, of course. But the Buddha had a certain bias, and it may well be that it is essential in world evolution for the Buddha to precede the Christ. For the bias of transcendence to become active in the world psyche as a purifying force and as a release for the earth forces to become sublimated prior to the downflow of the world embracing action of the Christos. Do you see what I mean? We need to see the two in conjunction. Buddha, with his characteristic, doubtless quite accurate, sublime state of Buddhic calm, was facing away from the earth. In so doing, was raising the earth up. The Christ was facing into the earth, was embracing the earth, seeding the earth. Both Buddha and Christ, of course, were doing this. But they had different bias. Therefore, Christ, which is spirit, manifesting directly into substance, could become fully and totally man, feeling, thinking, being as man, feeling, lamenting, weeping, suffering deliberately as man. There are those who say Christ didn't suffer. I don't think that's so. Christ did deliberately identify himself, his consciousness, downwards, and entered into hell in order to achieve what became known in the Christian mythos as the harrowing of hell. No detachment there. No non-registration of feeling, emotion, etc. there. We have to be a little careful about the formulae that are the received impressions and have a certain validity, definitely. But they're most valid and real when we actually cognize what it is the words are describing. No substitute for experience, especially in this area. So, before we deliberate, we have to reflect a little on the known, challenging examples, such as Krishnamurti, such as Vivekananda, such as Ramakrishna, and how different they were from Ramana. But then Ramana stayed on his mountaintop. He didn't wander among us. And broadly speaking, he associated only with those who revered him as a god. And when Aurobindo was told of an occasion when Ramana, who sat in his Buddha-like calm, undisturbed seemingly by anything, when Aurobindo was told that Ramana had been visited by a batch of very irksome evangelical Christian missionaries who had hectored him, he blew his top. And Aurobindo said, "I'm so pleased he can be dynamic." Now there is a factor here that I'm sure is common to all the yoga types. It is this, that whatever happens, whatever the ego structure is active with, whatever pattern of thought, emotion it becomes awash with, there is always the knower, the observer, the seer, who perceives all that is going on as a transient superficiality that comes and goes and will pass, as all things do pass. And the real detachment, the core of detachment, whatever supervening structure, nature has evolved to enable the entity to cope with the vastly rapidly changing, unique situations of the here and now. The real core of detachment lies in, however Vivekananda blew his top, or Krishnamurti blew his top, or even Ramana blew his top, there is that core which is the true state, the true being. And is not enslaved to outer circumstance. And that insight, that knowledge, is the essence, I'm sure, of the roots of detachment. Tea time.